Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about the death of Superman, as well as the second part of that story, which is the reign of the Supermen. And before I really dive into it, um, I've noticed through the course of doing this podcast that we have a really diverse array of listeners. Some people, for instance, listen to me because they already know a lot about comic books and they like hearing the stuff that I'm talking about. I've received mail from people who actually don't know anything about comic books, or maybe they're just starting in on the comic book genre and they're getting something out of the podcast. And then there's a third group who maybe it's because of the role playing part of this. Maybe they play something like Dungeons and Dragons and they've never paid any attention to comic books at all, right? And so because of that, I was going to do this video under the assumption that everybody already was very, very familiar with the death of Superman comic books. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought I had better do a really quick kind of capsulized version of that story to set things up, because I feel like you kind of need that foundation to then see what we were doing in our game, because part of what we did was very similar, part of what we did was very different. And then the third part of this video is going to be me sharing some of my memories about being a fan back then and stuff like that. So, that said, before I do that, make sure you smash the like button. Check to see if you're still subscribed, because YouTube loves to unsubscribe people without telling them. And leave us a comment always. It helps us out with the YouTube algorithm. And then also, we just love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and it's thanks to you. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being here. I appreciate you guys. Okay. So the death of Superman comics. The really short version, and there's a lot I could say. I could give you the origin story of certain characters, and you know what I mean? Um, I actually tried to make this video earlier today and it ended up being an hour long, and I'm trying to not do that. So what you really need to know, kind of the bare bones version of it, is that there's a monster called Doomsday. And Doomsday is underground, and when he starts off, he's wearing this green costume that covers his entire body. And Um, sort of a brief aside, in the later 90s, I was talking at comic book conventions with guys who worked for DC Comics. And something that bothered me was once Doomsday, the costume gets ripped up through the course of the story, to the point where he's kind of just wearing shorts and like nothing else. And once you see his body, he has these massive spikes and stuff like that. But I always thought it was weird that when he's wearing the costume, there's no bumps where those spikes would be, right? And so I asked the guys at the convention, and what they told me was that there was such a rush to put out the death of Superman from corporate, that they had not decided yet what Doomsday was going to look like. They didn't really know what he was, other than he was a big monster. They didn't know if he'd be like a reptile, or what he was going to be. So so at any rate, he starts off in the suit. He comes up to the normal level, and he begins this rampage across America. And multiple superheroes fight him and fail to stop him. One of the things we see in the comic book is the Justice League fights him. Back then, the Justice League consisted of characters like Blue Beetle, Booster Gold, Guy Gardner, Fire, Ice, characters like that, right? And so there's a scene in one of the comics where these guys are all knocked out. I think it took place on a farm. I haven't read it for a little while, so I'm kind of rusty. But at any rate, we see these sort of lower level characters are all just knocked out and stuff. Nobody can stop Doomsday. And so he makes his way to Metropolis, where finally he runs into Superman. And the two of them fight, and there's a whole lot I could say about this because unfortunately, DC likes to change its continuity pretty often. And that's going to apply to a lot of this video today. So bear that in mind because I know the guys who are familiar with comics are going to say, "Hey, what about this or what about that?" Understand there's multiple continuities. Okay. But at any rate, the gist is that they fight. It's this big knockdown, drag out fight. And in the end, both characters are laying there. Both characters in that moment appear to be dead. And for sure, the characters in this world where the story takes place, they think these two are dead and that they are never going to come back ever again. And that's basically the death of Superman story in a nutshell. So then think of that as chapter one. Chapter two then was the reign of the Supermen. And what it really did was it set up four other characters. At the time, the way DC was doing it was there would be four Superman comics come out every month. And so, for instance, one was called The Man of Steel. And so, in that comic, they introduced one of these four new Supermen, and his name is Steel. And some people are going to be very familiar with the character. For those who don't know who he is, he's an African American gadgeteer, kind of along the lines of like an Iron Man kind of thing. He was making weapons. He ends up building a suit of all silver power armor. In addition to that, he wears a red cape, which is an homage to Superman. When Steel first shows up on the scene, he has the Superman S logo on his chest, and it is, of course, all made of metal. It's all silver. He has a really big hammer, kind of like a huge sledgehammer kind of thing. And he is, of course, as his name suggests, an homage to the old folk tale. Um, and so his deal is that Superman had saved his life, and then when Superman seemed to lose his, Steel was very moved by this. And so what he's doing is he's not really so much saying I am Superman. He's just trying to say, Superman saved my life, so I'm trying to make it a good life. I'm trying to save as many other lives as I can, kind of a pay it forward kind of a thing. And it was also like an homage to what a great guy Superman was, right? Okay. So then the next character I want to talk about is the Eradicator. And the Eradicator is a little harder to explain. If I remember correctly, there was a comic at the time called Superman the Man of Tomorrow. And so I believe that's the one Eradicator was in because, in my humble opinion, Eradicator was conceived by the guys then, and of course, this is the early 90s, conceived to be kind of a more futuristic Superman, and so he had, like, weird energy powers. He had a suit that I thought it was kinda cool. We saw it a lot in the '90s where there for him, there was, like, a wide stripe of color down the middle, and then on the outsides of the suit, it was darker. In the case of the Eradicator, it was blue in the middle and black on the outside. Um, and then he also had a red cape like Superman's. He had a Superman logo on his chest, and then he had these, like a yellow visor. Um, and like I say, I think they were trying to make him futuristic and personality-wise, at least in my humble opinion, and obviously your mileage may vary. I was always reminded of RoboCop. I thought that was probably what they were inspired by there. And I don't know how that compares in terms of the second RoboCop movie. I don't know if this would be after that, maybe. But for sure, I feel like RoboCop would have been, like, really popular at the time, and so it to me seems entirely reasonable to assume that the writers were thinking in that direction, right? So that's the Eradicator character. And then speaking of movies with cyborgs and stuff that just came out, Terminator 2 was a huge deal in the early 90s. The later Terminator movies after Terminator 2, I personally think they didn't do so well, you know. I think they kinda tanked the popularity of the franchise, so now I hear people say a lot of negative stuff about the Terminator franchise, but hot on the heels of that second movie, Terminator was like insanely popular, right? So they had another one of these Supermen, and this one, in my humble opinion, was essentially Terminator Superman. They called him the Cyborg Superman. And he really did look like a Terminator Superman. If you'd blown parts of him off and you could see like the metal skull underneath and stuff like that. Um, and then the fourth guy is Superboy. And he is potentially hard to explain, actually. You would want to think that the easy answer is they cloned Superman and the clone is just young. He hadn't had enough time to grow up and da 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 da. I think that was probably their original idea with the character. And the longer Superboy has been around, the more they've kind of messed around with his origins and they've retconned him a bunch of times and so on and so forth. So, for instance, in the 90s, there was this character called Damage, and DC was really trying to push Damage there for a hot minute. And they had a big event in 1994, for instance, called Zero Hour, and Damage was like kind of a big deal there for a second. Obviously he didn't catch on because I feel like most people listening to this have probably never heard of the character, right? But at one point, some of his DNA was supposed to be what they used to make Superboy. I think that's been retconned out of existence now. Who knows though, because whatever I know has probably been retconned a dozen times since then. But but I think what became the continuity for the longest period of time, and this is relevant to some of the stuff we're going to talk about, is that there are multiple things of DNA going on with the Superboy character, and Lex Luthor had a hand in his creation, so Lex Luthor's DNA was baked into the recipe for Superboy, right? And one of the things they were doing with Superboy was there was this attitude at the time, and I'm going to talk a lot about this, that was very like anti, what do I want to say, like Silver Age. They, like the 90s, we kind of laugh about it now. In the 90s, everything was extreme. You know what I mean? Like G.I. Joe extreme. And yeah, they were just it was like there was a lot of kind of like edge lord kind of stuff. And so I think that some of those attitudes and the thought process behind a lot of that like marketing and stuff like that went into the creation of Superboy as far as the writing staff was concerned. So he wore a black leather jacket and he shaved the side of his head and he had an earring, and this isn't your father's Superboy, it was a lot of stuff like that. And so I think that's where that thing came from of him being part Lex Luthor. And I feel like they've kind of toned him down some over the years. Like honestly, the writing for that particular Superboy has been I'll say it varies. That'd be a nice way to put it. Depending on what comic book you read, he varies a lot. I have for sure read a bunch of comics over the years where he is just a huge prick. I mean, there's no other way around it. I've seen him fight Superman. I've seen him yelling at Superman, say, "Oh, I never wanted to have anything to do with you. You're not my real dad." It's a lot of stuff like that, and I feel like the writers were so worried, like they didn't want like this like Leave It to Beaver, old-fashioned kind of a Superboy, right? So, the stuff they were doing, I feel like the thing was, I was actually the age that Superboy was depicted at the time, right? And the thing is, the writers were not my age, right? The writers were all old guys, and I don't think they understood people my age. And so I felt like a lot of the stuff they were doing with Superboy to me felt almost like a parody or something, that like if you have an out of touch writer and they're trying to make him um capture the spirit of the 90s, for me it just didn't hit right. And then there was a comic I read where he was a villain. He was just a straight up villain called Black Zero. And he was a huge problem, in the same way that characters like Homelander or Omni-Man. are a problem in, certain modern stories now. So so that's basically the reign of the Superman, and that kind of is the setup that you need to know. That's the stuff from the comics roughly at the time, or, like I say, continuity varies, but I feel like that's a pretty good approximation of how it used to go, right? Okay. So, based on all of that, then, is what we had to work with when we were going to put together our version of the death of Superman. And for anybody tuning in who's not familiar with my channel, a big thing that our game world is kind of famous for is real time instead of comic book time. And so that means that in our game world, the original Superman debuted in 1938. And then, in the World War II era, generally speaking, up through about the mid 50s is called the Golden Age. And that's another thing where different people define it different ways. And that's fine if you define it differently. I'll just tell you how we define it in our game. So then from around 1956, which is the first appearance of Barry Allen, to 1974, it's the first appearance of Wolverine. That chunk in there is the Silver Age, and when Wolverine kind of shows up, it's a game changer, and then that kicks off the next age after that, which at the time the Death of Superman was written, I feel like they were calling it the Modern Age back then. These days we might call it the Bronze Age. And for us in our game, we kind of say the next big thing is it really is the death of Superman and Spawn and stuff like that. So around 1992 is when there's another one of these like a sea change in the vibe of the comics, right? And after that, interestingly enough, an idea that got floated around a lot was to call the next age the Dark Age. And I mentioned that for a reason too, that the death of Superman kicked off some weird stuff in the comics, right? So, for instance, these four Supermen that I talked about, not Steel. Steel's a great guy. The other three, though, on some level, the other three guys are a problem on some level, right? Um, and then if you look at other stuff DC was doing, like with the big three, Batman got his back broken. He got replaced by Azrael, who, was way more violent than Bruce Wayne ever was. They replaced Wonder Woman. She was no longer Diana. Now we brought in a character called Artemis that had like long red hair and a ponytail, and she was, a bad girl, and stuff like that. That was very much the spirit of the 90s. That's kind of where they're going with this whole dark age idea, right? So, how do I want to put this? Okay, so then in our game, let's just start from sort of the beginning of how it went in our game. If I remember, because I make these videos well in advance now, when I can't do the timestamps until they drop, I don't think. So I'll try to remember to do this. If I forget to do timestamps, someone leave me a comment and I'll, I'll put the timestamps in. But so now we're going to start talking about how it went in our game, right? So just like the comics, it begins with Doomsday. He's underground. He's in this container thing. He breaks out. He makes his way to the surface, and he goes on a rampage across America. And so we have our original characters, not all of them, but some of them were feeling kind of froggy and thought they could fight him. And so they did. And spoiler, they all lose. And in some cases, because we're rolling dice for every one of those fights. In some cases, he kills people, and certain guys who would play the game long enough, their character would get kind of powerful, and they'd get kind of a chip on their shoulder in a way and go, "Oh, I could do that. Oh, yeah. If Superman can fight him, I can fight him. I'm way cooler than Superman." Well, these guys died, and so nobody stops Doomsday, and he gets to Metropolis just like he did in the comics, and then he fights Superman. And so now here's the first big difference. So, like I said, we use this real time idea so that the original Superman in our game started in 1938. When we get up to the Crisis, because a lot of people talk about, pre-Crisis Superman was really, really strong, where he could push planets and all sorts of amazing things, right? And then the post-Crisis Superman, which the Crisis is in the mid-80s, the Superman after that point in time is now a new Superman. He's not that strong. He's a little more um grounded. I don't know what word I want to use there, but the point is he has lower stats, right? And so in our game world, we decided to represent that idea by having him be the son of Lois and Clark. And so, generally speaking, and this isn't exact, but it's kind of a ballpark idea for those unfamiliar with DC Heroes, in the game itself, in first edition, they gave us the stats for the pre-Crisis Superman, and he had a strength of 50. And then in second and third edition, they gave us the stats for the post-Crisis Superman. He had a strength of 25. So that's what we used. And we said the reason for the change in the stats was he's only half Kryptonian, so therefore he's only half as strong as his dad was, right? We thought, well, that makes perfect sense. It works. It's great. Well, so it's great to represent the era, right? And then the other thing going on, by the way, in the 90s was Superman the Animated Series. And for anyone unfamiliar with that, I'll just make this really short. He was very weak. I would argue that Superman probably has a strength of 12, actually, where they cut it in half yet again. But the point is, a lot of the people playing the game in the 90s when we were running these games were getting used to the idea of a weak Superman, right? But we had already established in our game, very well established, that full-blooded Kryptonians are tougher than that, right? That they have these pre-crisis power levels. So here's the thing. Doomsday is from Krypton. He's a science experiment, right? But his stats are going to reflect the idea of a full-blooded Kryptonian. So you probably see where this is going, right? You would start with a normal Kryptonian who's already a huge problem, and then you add a couple APs here and there, throw in some extra powers like Claw's power, stuff like that. So Doomsday's a massive, massive problem. In our game, what we basically had, more or less, was the idea of a pre-crisis level Doomsday. But he's fighting a post-crisis level Superman, right? So it's not hard to figure out who wins. Doomsday wins. And so whereas in the comic, the way that scene ends is they're both on the ground, they both appear to be dead, right? In our game, the post-crisis Superman, who is the son, they're kind of doing that now in the comics, where the current Superman, at least as of me recording this, to the best of my knowledge, the current Superman now is John Kent, who is the son of Lois and Clark, and he's not as strong as his dad, and blah 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 blah, right? Really, it's the same idea. Um, yeah, so he died. He died. And whereas in the comics, it was kind of this, I don't know if you want to call it a marketing scheme or what, but they behind the scenes knew they were going to bring Superman back, right? We did not. We left him dead. And I'll talk in a little bit about why that was. Um Basically, well, I'll nutshell it real quick. Um I've talked to people since then, and I mentioned that I thought Superman would be dead forever. And it's usually when I'm talking online to someone about comic books, it's someone half my age who is now used to, for instance, Jason Todd died and he came back, right? And Bucky died and he came back as the Winter Soldier or whatever. And so it happens so much now where nobody stays dead anymore. Gwen Stacy used to stay dead, and now we've got Spider Gwen and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of younger fans that are like, well, you're an idiot if you thought Superman was going to stay dead. Mind you, in the early 90s when the story came out, Jason Todd was still dead. Gwen Stacy was still dead. Bucky was still dead. You know what I mean? Uncle Ben was dead. I thought Superman was gonna stay dead. Um, and if you bring characters back willy-nilly, then there are no consequences, right? There are no stakes. And if there are no stakes in your stories, nothing matters then. Nobody's gonna be invested, nobody's gonna care, right? So our take was that if we're gonna do the death of Superman, we're actually going to do the death of that specific Superman, right? So mind you, there had been a post-crisis Superman. In our version of things, he was exposed to gold kryptonite in the mid 80s. And so he's actually alive when this happens. And he's at home in Smallville on the Kent farm. And he's watching on TV. And mind you, he in the mid 80s, he still had the mostly black hair and all that, but he had the white streaks on the side. Since he's been exposed to gold kryptonite, now he is aging from that point on. Does that make sense? Um, Lois is still alive at this point in our timeline. I could say a bunch about her, but I won't. But the point is, so Lois and Clark, parents of the Superman who fought Doomsday, right? They're watching on TV and they see their son fall. And so they're obviously very upset. They're hugging each other. Um, and then Doomsday's still running around though in our game world. And what else should I say at this point? Oh, so in the comics, by the way, it was Ma and Pa Kent who were watching on TV and they saw Clark fall, right? Um, we couldn't use Ma and Pa Kent in our game because, of course, like I said, real time Ma and Pa Kent are for sure dead by the time the 90s roll around. So the original Lois and the original Clark kind of take their place in this story then. Well, the thing is, in the comics, when Superman quote unquote died, Lois Lane was there, and obviously she loved Superman and so on and so forth, and she is crying over his body basically. And it's a very iconic moment. It gets used a lot. The art from that comic book issue, I've seen it made into posters and all sorts of things. So we felt like that was this kind of story beat that we didn't have. And we weren't really sure what to do there. And we decided instead of using romantic love, you know, like in certain circles, they talk about agape love, or, we would just say, think of it more like, um, what would be a really good example of this? Um, Boy, I'm drawing a blank, but at any rate, just two characters who they mean a lot to each other, but just not in that romantic way, right? I suppose we could do Superman and Batman, or I don't know, sometimes the Ninja Turtles deal with that kind of stuff, or I was trying to think of um maybe an example from Marvel, but I'm kind of drawing a blank there too at the moment. But at any rate, just we decided to use Powerhouse as, his whole thing. He at this point in our game, and the Powerhouse thing is complicated. So Powerhouse is actually the son of the original Superman, born in the 70s. So it's the pre-crisis Superman as Powerhouse's dad. And then something happened where Powerhouse forgot all of this and everybody kind of forgot about him, right? And so we kind of contextualized that in recent years. Everybody's familiar with the story now, I think, of Doctor Strange cast a spell because the world had found out Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Doctor Strange cast this spell where everybody forgot Peter Parker was Spider-Man. We did something very similar in our game, and we had used original characters, then we kind of retconned it later and said it really was Doctor Strange, just because it was easier for people to understand. But the point is, um, he had cast this spell, because there was an 80s Superboy and everybody knew who he was and so on and so forth. And pretty much it's very similar to what happens in the movie with Spider-Man and Doctor Strange where the spell gets interrupted, yada yada yada. But in our version of things, Superboy also forgets that he's Superboy. And he had used up all of the yellow sun radiation that he had stored up in his cells. So he was powerless around 1989, right? And so now as we get into the 90s, he's he's out in the sun. Whether he remembers who he is or not, he's out in the sun and he's getting powers. And he doesn't know why. So he actually thinks he's a mutant, kind of X-Men style mutant, right? And so it's like, well, now I can fly and I have an energy attack and I'm really strong and I'm really durable and blah blah blah. He doesn't know why. But it just so happens his role model was Superman in either, I mean, for sure liked the pre-crisis Superman. He liked the post-crisis Superman. And the post-crisis Superman, by the way, would be his half brother because the post-crisis Superman is the son of Lois and Powerhouse is not the son of Lois. But yeah, when he forgot that he was Superboy, his friends gave him the name Powerhouse. So that's kind of what's going on there. But Powerhouse's whole deal was he idolized Superman and he looked up to him and he was his inspiration. And he's like, when I grow up, I want to be like him. So when he sees the whole Doomsday thing, Powerhouse fights Doomsday and loses big time because he hasn't absorbed enough yellow sun radiation to be, stronger and so on and so forth. But he gets there, during this fight, he's actually there when Superman dies. And the interesting thing we did in this moment as Superman lays there dying, he can talk because, that's how it just always goes when you give a character a death scene. And this is the end. This is the permanent end of the post-crisis Superman. So these are brothers we're talking about, literal brothers, right? And the thing is, the the post-crisis Superman who was dying because of the Doomsday fight had gone to the 30th century and been doing stuff with the Legion of Superheroes. And at this point in the story, he knows who Powerhouse really is. And so he actually tells Powerhouse um like you're it. I'm tagging you in. You got to be the next guy. You got to take care of the world. And so it's this massive moment for Powerhouse. And he dies. He doesn't sort of say why you have to take care of things. Powerhouse is kind of left with more questions than answers, but it was a really touching moment. It was really well done. And by the way, I was not the GM of that one. We didn't do this as one big adventure. It was multiple adventures. Um, but yeah, it was like really well done. And so then Powerhouse starts wearing the logo on his chest. And he already was wearing what just so happens to basically be the John Kent Superman costume where it's like red on the neck and shoulders and everything. It goes down to a point, and then there on the chest is like the Superman logo, right? We had done the exact same thing. So um so then that kind of we go from there into the reign of the Superman idea. So at this point in Powerhouse's life, he doesn't know he used to be legit Superboy, right? He feels like he's got kind of like imposter syndrome and stuff like that, but he's moving in this direction of becoming more and more like a Superboy, right? And what we're seeing in the story is this he's on the right track of figuring out who he really is, figuring out who his dad really is, and just all of that, right? So it's very big for him. And then along comes the clone, right? And what we had said was that if Cadmus was going to clone a Superman, but they had two to pick from, unlike in the comics. If they could choose between pre-crisis or a post-crisis Superman, who would you pick? You know what I mean? So we said they were actually using the DNA of the Golden Age Superman slash Silver Age Superman, because in our game world, they're the same guy. So that is Connell. And but then Lex Luthor messed with the process. So some of Lex Luthor's villainy is then part of this character, right? And I can't remember if I said it already or not. There was a comic book where Connell was just a straight up villain called Black Zero. We kind of leaned into that a little bit, so he is created and he's just angry from day one. He doesn't, it doesn't like that he even exists, doesn't like that he's having to live in the shadow of other Supermen. Our version in the Earth K dimension, which again, friendly reminder for everybody, this is not Earth 1, it's not Earth 616. It's a different world, right? In this particular dimension, this particular Connell is just a prick from day one, And so we did a game then where he fights Powerhouse. And more or less, the idea is they're going to fight over who gets to go by the name Superboy. Connell wins big time. Because he's fully powered. And again, Powerhouse had lost all of his power and he's like slowly kind of recharging. So there was that. And then we introduced the other three Supermen, and that was pretty much exactly like the comics, exactly what I described earlier. Steel was a great guy, so on and so forth. Eradicator. Actually, we made our Eradicator a little nicer slightly. The Eradicator in the comics is sometimes kind of a villain, and then at other times he's like an anti-hero. I would say our Eradicator is pretty consistently actually an anti-hero. I can't think of a single instance of him going full-on villain. And then our version of the Cyborg Superman is pretty much the Cyborg Superman from the comics. I'm trying to think if there's anything I'm leaving out. I guess that's it. This actually snowballs, and in tomorrow's video is going to tie into this. It's kind of like a chapter 3 kind of idea. Is in one of our old games we had ran previously, Superman had gotten his hands on the Infinity Gauntlet. And he had it in the Fortress of Solitude. And so he had done this thing where only he could wield it. And the game master for that game was a friend of mine named Howard Warrens. And so Howard ruled that when Superman died, the gauntlet was no longer beholden to anyone, right? And so the next chapter in our game world is that Thanos goes to the Fortress of Solitude, and now he can take the gauntlet. He couldn't get it until now. And so for us, all of this snowballs into the Infinity Gauntlet saga, and that's tomorrow's thing. Okay, so for the third part of this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about my real world experiences with the Death of Superman comic and what was going on at the time, and that had a big effect on how we did things in the game. And it for us, this story in the game represents kind of something else. It represents a change in society more kind of than it actually represents the characters. Okay. So at any rate, I remember the day that I heard about Superman was going to die. I was in physics class in high school, and my teacher's name was Mr. Burns, and we were taking a test at the time. And Mr. Burns liked comic book stuff. He didn't advertise it. By the way, back in the day, this is relevant too. Back in my day, at least where I grew up, if you wanted bullied or if you wanted someone to beat you up or whatever, the quickest way to make that happen was to say you liked comic books. It was not accepted where I lived. Like, you were branded as a nerd, and like, no, people were going to kick your butt big time, you know? Um, so I think that for Mr. Burns, I assume that's the way it was when he was growing up too. And so he didn't broadcast the fact that he was a comic book fan, but if he saw a kid with a Trapper Keeper with, Spider-Man on it or something, he would, kind of just say like, "Hey, cool Trapper, man," or, whatever, that kind of thing. So you get the gist. But at any rate, we're in the middle of a test and Mr. Burns gets a phone call and he says something. He's like, "Oh my God," or something like that. He was like shocked. And so we are thinking something bad happened, like something in the real world is what I'm trying to say. Like that a real person had died or something, some kind of a tragedy. And so he gets off the phone and he does that thing people do sometimes where you kind of blink a couple times where you're like taking in some news. And one of the girls in the class says, "What's wrong, Mr. Burns?" And he blinks a couple times. And I remember he looked at us and he goes, "Superman died." And there's this quiet moment. It was already quiet because we were taking a test, but there was just this really quiet moment. And I said, and mind you, this is before Christopher Reeve had his accident with the horse and all that. I remember saying, "You mean Christopher Reeve? Did something happen to Christopher Reeve?" And everybody was really quiet. And he goes, "No, no, I mean the fictional character, Superman. They're going to kill him. DC announced today they're killing him. Everybody's talking about it." And I was like, "What?" And I couldn't wrap my head around it. And I thought that Superman was just one of these characters that would be around forever. I couldn't imagine a world without Superman. And so then the thing that happened next that really struck me was that me and Mr. Burns were the only two people in that room that gave a crap. Nobody else cared. And not only did they not care, I remember a kid named Mark who I can't remember how he worded it, but the vibe was basically like good riddance. He's a crappy character anyways. And I was like, "What's wrong with Superman?" And again, I can't really remember what Mark was saying, but he starts complaining about the character. And he's like, "Well, he doesn't kill people. Like I like this comic book character because he just kills people. It doesn't matter. He could just be in a bad mood. You look at him the wrong way and he kill you. That's hardcore, man. That's awesome. And Superman is lame." And I remember listening to him and I said something I can't remember how I worded it, but I said something to him like, I was like, I think what you're really complaining about is morality. You don't like morals. And he was like, "Man, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about." I was like, "No, really. Like, this is really about morality." And that was how I took it. And like other people started talking to me, and after the bell rang, this was the period right before lunch. And so everybody else leaves the classroom. And I just kind of sat there for a minute, like, I can't believe they're going to kill Superman. And the issue hadn't come out yet, right? It was they had announced they were going to make the issue. They announced it in advance because, of course, they wanted everybody to run out, and everybody did kind of. The people who were not comic book fans are like, "Oh, this is going to be worth $1 million by the year 2020 or whatever." So they were running out um, to get their copy of it. And that's why DC made this big announcement. That's why DC was acting like, "No, no, we're really doing it. It's forever, man. It's going to be forever." And I remember sitting there for a minute, just like digesting it, and I realized I should go to the lunchroom. So I got up and I was kind of like slowly walking out, and I remember Mr. Burns is like, "I feel you, man. Like, I'm right there with you. Like this really sucks." And I said, "Yeah, like this does really suck." And I went to the lunchroom, and there were a couple guys were cool about it, a couple friends of mine, but there were maybe twice as many guys who were all kind of saying the same stuff Mark was saying. about, "Oh, it's so Superman is so cheesy." And I was like, "Why?" And they all would start their complaints were all about morality. And I thought, "That's really weird." You know, like, that's weird that this is where you guys are coming from with this, that you want Superman to be dead because it's kind of like it was in a way, it was like and I'm not saying everybody everywhere is this way or anything like that. Nothing's ever unanimous. I found surprisingly how regional things are when it comes to this sort of thing. But they were like offended. They didn't like seeing uh the right thing. You know what I mean? Because I think it made them question their own actions. They did not like that. I think that these particular guys liked characters, and I won't name characters by name, but I think there were a lot of characters, especially in the 90s, especially at this time, who they were. It was almost these shock value characters that were doing stuff that, you never would have seen in the Silver Age, for instance. And that's what these guys liked. And the more I would talk to people over the years about it, the more I thought, you really just you don't want to feel judged. You don't want your own morality being called into question, things like that. I don't know if that's good for society, though. I think we should be introspective. I know I, for sure, do things I should not do. And so that kind of leads into this next thing is um sometimes, in real life, I'll just see stuff either online or on the news or whatever. I just see stuff that gets me down, you know? And my spirits get low. I have depression. I tend to be pessimistic by nature, stuff like that. I'll make this real quick too. Where I live used to be a really nice place when I was a little kid, and we have a prison here, and they changed the policies. And so it used to be that when people got out of prison, they moved away. But because of the policy changes, now the prisoners don't move away. So they start living here. And whatever bad thing landed them in prison, a lot of them just keep doing it, right? So in the particular area where I live, crime has been going up over the years. And by the way, they had a prison for kids that were not yet 18 at my school. So some of these guys I was talking to, it was called Choice Place. Some of these guys I was talking to who were so offended by morality were literally they didn't live at home with their parents. They had kind of a prison bus that brought them to our school in the morning, and then they would take them back to we called it the kiddie prison. They'd take them back there 3 o'clock or whatever then, you know? Um, but yeah, I was seeing the world change. I didn't like the changes I was seeing, and the reason I mentioned my particular area is, that's not gonna be everybody's experience, obviously, right? But for me, I was seeing my world change. And when I saw the way people reacted to Superman, it really bothered me. And to this day, when I see stuff that it kind of like makes me lose my faith in humanity, so to speak. Um, what I have always done over the years is I will watch that first Superman movie with Christopher Reeve. Um, and there's such amazing dialogue in that movie. The stuff he says is like uplifting. The music is, it's uplifting and it's inspirational, it's aspirational. Um, and it kind of recharges my battery. And sometimes I catch myself, just to be brutally honest, I'll catch myself being a jerk. And it's always in my nature to kind of fall towards that point, right? And for me personally, and I know a lot of people think this is funny or whatever, but I'll watch Superman the movie. And that's what does it for me, is I'll hear some quotes and there's some good advice and stuff in there. And It just kind of reminds me of more where I should be at, what I should be shooting for. I should be striving to be as kind as Superman is. There were sort of jokes flying around for a while, and they would cater it from character to character. But the one I always took to heart actually was, what would Superman do? And sometimes in my interactions now as an adult, when I'm talking to people, I will just think to myself, yeah, if I were Superman, or if Christopher Reeve were here, what would he say in this moment? And that's what I'll say. And it's almost always the right thing to do or say, you know. Um, so at any rate, so yeah, I go home from school that day, finding out that they're gonna kill Superman, and I put in the VHS tape of that original 1978 movie. And so I get home from school around 3:30. I don't know, let's say the movie is 2 hours long. I'm probably not factoring in time to whatever, make myself a bite to eat when I got home or whatever too, but the point is, the movie is wrapping up around the time my mom gets home from work, right? She had heard it work, and ironically, she was like, "We need to get one of those comics. That's gonna be worth so much money. You could sell that and pay for a year of college," and, stuff like that. And, which was when I had my comic book store, we had the Death of Superman in the quarter bin section, by the way, but at any rate, um, but yeah, so she had heard it work, and she came downstairs, and she saw me watching that movie, and I remember she was like, "Are you okay?" And I said, "You know what? No, I'm not. I'm really having trouble with this. I love Superman, and this sucks so much." And she said, "Well, let me cheer you up. Let me take you out to eat. Let me cheer you up." And I love my mom. My mom was great. She passed away not too long after that, actually. But her solution for a lot of things was to spend money. And so we went to Red Lobster and had dinner, and afterwards we went to the mall. And the mall used to have this store. It was almost like Hot Topic before there was such a thing as Hot Topic. I can't remember the name of this store because there's been a bunch of stores like it over the years, like Gadzooks and I want to say Kaleidoscope and some stuff like that. But at any rate, the point is, at this particular store, on the back wall, they had comic book T-shirts for sale, and Superman T-shirts, actually, specifically. And so I saw that and I thought, I really want a Superman T-shirt. And we went in, and I asked my mom, "Could I have a Superman T-shirt?" She said, "Yeah, of course, yes, absolutely." And so I went in, and I was playing football and everything at the time. I wore a 2X and asked them if they had any, and they literally had one left. And the guy said everybody came in that day and they wanted one. That gave me a little hope. That was like, well, that's cool. Somebody remembers them the way I do. That's cool at least. Um, and then the funny thing is, if you were to look at my yearbook pictures, where they're like, "Oh, here he is, and he's the president of the art club," or "Here he is, and he's doing the cartoon for the school newspaper," or "Here he is, and he's a photographer," whatever, for a sports event or whatever, I was doing. The funny thing is, in almost every single one of those, I'm wearing that Superman T-shirt. Um, I had a bunch of people back in the day like, "Do you only own one shirt?" Stuff like that. I'm like, "No, I just like Superman, man. I wash it." But, I remember then after graduation, um, like, there was an X-Men Wildcats crossover where they were like, "Here's Wolverine and Zealot," and they're hanging out in the Golden Age, and so the name of that issue was the Golden Age. And then they did one, and I wanna say it was Gambit and Jean Grey or whatever, and it's the Silver Age. But so they're doing the different ages, and so when they get up to the '90s, I thought it was very interesting that the name they chose was the Dark Age. And for a little while, I saw that kind of making the rounds when I'd go to comic shops and stuff. I would see everybody referring to the 90s as the dark age of comics. And at any rate, I remember one day Howard pulling me aside because at this point it's, I don't know, 1995 or something, 96 maybe. And I'm still wearing a Superman t-shirt all the time. And Howard kind of pulls me aside and says, "Hey, you need to kind of cool it with the Superman thing. It's not really cool anymore." And he's like, you need to go get yourself a t-shirt of a character like the Crow or like Wolverine or Ghost Rider or something like that. But you seem kind of like a nerd wearing a Superman t-shirt. And he's like, it was cool when we were kids. Don't get me wrong, but it's not really okay anymore. You shouldn't be doing that. And I remember being like, well, then I'll be uncool, man. Like I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do. And I was like, I love Superman, and I'm never apologizing for that. And the funny irony there is I rubbed off on Howard, and then he bought a Superman t-shirt, and he was trying to kind of own it as like, I've always been a Superman fan. But no, I caught a lot of flack for that. And I felt like for whatever reason, like when I was in college, I felt like everybody I knew wore black every day. And I personally I felt like Dark Age was an incredibly fitting title for that time period. Um and so that was all kind of part of why we did what we did in the game. And I felt like after, in our game after Superman died, yes, things did get darker. And there for a while our game world got worse. You know what I mean? And so we would have characters in the game. Superman became less like a person and more like what do I want to call it? Like anchor point wouldn't quite be the right word. But when characters would want to talk about morality, they would kind of reference Superman, like, "Oh, I miss the days when Superman was still around," and, stuff like that. Or, "If Superman was here, he'd fix this." And then, of course, it was the job of whoever those player characters were. Now they had to fix it. And from a role-playing game point of view, we thought that was really, really good. That role-playing games are supposed to be about the players, and so we did that. And then the other thing I really liked about it, and I think I mentioned this already, but I could be wrong because I've tried to record this video a bunch of times. But there were consequences then. There were stakes. That's really important in a role-playing game. You really do need characters to die so that when the characters don't die, when the good guys do win, you kind of celebrate for them. You get more excited for them that things went right, you know. Um, yeah. But I think that's pretty good. That's our Death of Superman stuff. I want to thank you guys for listening. As always, do the thing, right? Hit like, check to see if you're still subscribed, and leave us a comment. Where were you when Superman died? I'd be very curious from the guys who remember it. Or what were your thoughts on it? Did you think at the time he was going to be dead forever? Did you think, now they're bringing him back? Because everybody's different. I've heard over the years, different people from different walks of life with different answers on that. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear about that. Let me know in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for listening. From everybody here involved with our game, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.